So the Falklands, unlike many contested places, right? Prior to European explorers, there was no indigenous population, right? So the islands were uninhabited, yeah, up until 1690, right? So the first undisputed landing on the islands was by the English captain, John Strong. So yeah, so he landed there in 1690, but islands remained uninhabited until 1764, at which point the French landed. And they landed on East Falklands, and they set up a base there. And then the British end up landing in Saunders Island in 1766, and they set up Fort Egmont. So that's basically kind of where they were based. However, in 1766, the French surrendered their claim to the islands to the Spanish, because the Spanish were the ones who controlled that general region before then, right? So the Spanish end up taking Port Egmont in 1770. However, the British end up returning in 1771. And the British voluntarily left in 1774. At which point the islands were handed over to the Spanish Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, right? So again, it wasn't, you know, so it was part of like the Spanish Empire, but yeah, so no Argentina yet. I'm just making this point. Now, as discussed last time in our video about Napoleonic Wars, right? Spain ended up being invaded by France, and so as a result, it led to a lot of instability within the Spanish Empire, and so this led to the South American Wars of Independence, right? So during that time, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata end up gaining its independence, but also during this time the British end up landing on the actual mainland itself, so around Buenos Aires and around what is today Uruguay. They tried to basically take that over from the Spanish, and in the same way as they'd taken South Africa from the Dutch, right? So that's basically what they tried to do. However, this ended up being unsuccessful, so the British end up returning back to their base in South Africa, right? And during this invasion, they also seized the Falklands, right? So the governor of the island ended up being evacuated in 1806, and then 5 years later in 1811, the garrison ended up leaving as well. So the only people who were left on the Falklands were the gauchos, who were basically South American cowboys, and a few fishermen, right? So that was all that was kind of left and stuff, right? And again, during this time, it wasn't really like much really going on. As we discussed in that last video, we were talking about Napoleon. So the Rio de la Plata end up getting its independence, and obviously there to fight a long war for its independence, right? So it was from 1810 to 1816, and what came out of that was the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. So a little bit after this, the Americans end up sending a warship down there, which was the USS Lexington in 1831, and they end up dissolving the governance of that island. So they said, right, so the Rio de la Plata no longer controls this area. So at this point, no one really had any real claim on it. So the British in 1833 came to the island, and they've been there ever since. Well, apart from during like the Falklands conflict and stuff, right? So that's basically Britain's claim. So they've been controlling the islands pretty much continuously from 1833 onwards. Now you might ask, why are you telling me all this just useless information and stuff, right? Well, the reason for that, and it was very, very tedious, believe me, it was difficult to film, because I had to be like, wait, who did what in what year, and who landed, but it's really, really tedious. However, I told you all that just to give a bit of context of saying basically that the Argentine claim is not really as straightforward as they make out. Like they try and make it out like, oh, like this is, you stole like sovereign Argentine territory and stuff, and we want it back. No, not at all. And also as well, Argentina didn't even exist at that point. So as I said, it's the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. The Argentine Confederacy wasn't established until 1835, right? And then like the actual Argentina itself came a few decades later. So they're making this claim because of the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. But the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, which is quite a mouthful to say, that included Argentina, it included Bolivia, it included Uruguay, and also included large parts of Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile, right? So if you're going to make those claims that you own the island because the United Provinces owned that, why are you not also claiming all these other places, right? The reason for that is because they know that they can get away with trying to claim the British one, in the Falklands, but they can't get away with that, because they can paint this as being anti-colonialism, and like decolonization, but they can't like do it for those other countries. That's the main reason. And unfortunately, that's why most countries in the world take the Argentine side, including most places in Latin America, with the exception of some notable ones, which we'll get onto a little bit later. So you might imagine, due to the rhetoric from Argentina nowadays, that throughout all this time, there was a bitter, like really tense relationship between Argentina and Britain. Not exactly. As a matter of fact, so Britain obviously had the largest empire the world had ever seen, but there was also something known as the Informal Empire, right? And this was a series of different places around the world where Britain didn't directly control, but it had a huge amount of influence in, and it had a lot of investments, right? And Argentina was the number one place here within this so-called informal empire, right? So, so a lot of the banking systems which were in place in Argentina was controlled by the British. They also forced free trade on the Argentinians, because Argentina and most places in Latin America normally have like protectionist policies, and actually most places in the world tend to have protectionist policies, but it was the British in the mid-19th century who were pioneers of pushing free trade, because free trade is the reason why you have so much prosperity nowadays around the world, right? It's because it's better for the consumers, it's better for everyone to have free trade. Protectionism is basically putting a blockade on yourself. So it doesn't actually help. Like, kind of, there's the seen versus the unseen. It's long to explain with economics stuff, but whereas countries like Argentina would tend towards protectionism, Britain forced them to have free trade, and as a result they end up becoming substantially wealthy. So wealthy, in fact, that so in 1870 the GDP per capita in Argentina was roughly around 76% of what it was in Britain, right? So Britain was the richest country on earth in terms of GDP per capita, or maybe Switzerland or one other like place might have been a little bit higher at that time, but it was very, very high up. And by 1900 it ended up being 96% of what Britain's GDP per capita was, right? And this is a result of the amount of money being put in for railways and for banking and all these different things, and like for Argentinian agriculture, because obviously they exported a lot of beef to the empire, not the rest of the world. So all this was done kind of with the British putting in a lot of money and stuff, right? And actually, just to give an idea of just how much this is, obviously you've got different sources. This is the whole thing with history. It's a debate. But according to a source, in 1890, 40% of Britain's overseas direct capital, end up going to Argentina, right? So all the money that Britain invested in different places around the world, it didn't go to Australia, didn't go to Canada, didn't go to India, didn't go to Africa. It went to Argentina, right? So a huge amount of money coming from Britain to Argentina to help prop up their economy. So this is the reason why Argentina at this time was one of the wealthiest countries in the whole world. So you'd think that the Argentinians, knowing all that, would be a little bit more kind of grateful and stuff. And actually a big reason why they're not doing so well now is kind of because they went in the opposite direction to that. And also Britain, unfortunately, went in the opposite direction to that. Because as a result of World War One and World War Two, and obviously like the Depression, etc., countries like Britain and many other places around the world went the opposite way from free trade, and they decided to go more towards protectionism. So if you're a country which is very export dependent, like Argentina was, it meant that if no one wants to really buy your goods, then that's going to really hurt your economy, right? And on top of that, after World War II, you end up having Perón, who ended up taking over, right? So, a lot of Argentinians, still love him today, but he was basically a populist, and he basically blamed all of Argentina's problems on two things, right? One was the control of the Argentinian economy by foreign investors and stuff. So so the banks and all these different industry and stuff, right? So what he ended up doing then was nationalizing a lot of things and end up redistributing a lot of the wealth. And the problem with redistributing wealth to too great of extent is that eventually you disincentivize the creation of new wealth. And on top of that, he stoked Argentinian nationalism, right? And one of the main things that he used to unite the Argentinian people was the Malvinas, which is actually the Falkland Islands, right? So on Argentinian maps, end up being a thing where it's like, right, Falklands, the Malvinas, they are Argentinian, right? And it's our national mission to retake these islands from the British here, these evil colonizers, look at these people. We need to take these islands back from them, and then we will have our restored glory and stuff, right? Now, neither of these policies really worked out for Argentina very well. And we can see this in the fact of when Perón eventually ended up leaving office and stuff, well, he was overthrown in a coup. You end up having a military junta there, and the leader of this military junta was General Galtieri, right? So Galtieri and his minions, when they were running the Argentinian government, you end up having hyperinflation. So, during the time when the British were in control of it, one thing that the British were really, really opposed to and were for nearly all of their history and stuff, is having inflation. You don't want to have inflation too high of a level. You want to keep the currency stable, because then all the bad things that end up coming from inflation and stuff, like higher prices, etc., etc. So the British had Argentina on a very kind of stable basis. However, as a result of the kind of Peronist reforms, you end up having hyperinflation. So by 1981, the inflation rate in Argentina was over 600%, right? And so, that means that if you earn $1 today, a year from now, you're going to need to have $600 to equate that same thing. And obviously the same thing with pounds as well, right? So you got £1 this year, you're going to need £600 the next year, which means that your savings are going to be wiped out unless you're incredibly, incredibly wealthy, which means that the price of things are going up. If you're on a fixed income, it's not going to keep up with the high rate of inflation. So people's savings, people's livelihoods completely ruined. So as a distraction to all that, they was right, we need to have a war. And the first place they went to try to have this war was not actually Britain, it was Chile, right? So that was the Latin American country, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, right? So first of all, they wanted to go to fight Chile, right? They wanted to take some islands, they wanted to take some land from the Chileans. However, this was stopped by the intervention of the Pope. So Pope John Paul II, he was right, you guys are both Catholics, please don't fight each other, let's just have peace and stuff, right? So as a result, the Argentinians were okay, cool, we won't attack another Catholic country. However, those damn British, we're gonna attack them. And so I was right, we're gonna get all these troops, and we're gonna fight, and we're gonna fight a bloody conflict and stuff, and we're gonna come out of it being victorious, and yes, we're gonna be a proud nation again. We're gonna have beaten the British Empire, right? However, what no one told the Argentinians is that most British people don't even know where the Falklands is. And so, especially in 1982, people did not know where this thing was. They were huh? Where, what? Where's the Falklands been invaded? Where's that? And it also as well, during this time, so you had the Thatcher government, and during that time they had made a bunch of budget cuts to the Navy and stuff, and just to the army in general. So they didn't expect there to be a war. So as a result, they only had a platoon who were defending the whole island, right? And Falklands, even nowadays, only has 3,000 people on it, right? And all it has is sheep and fish. Sheep and fish, right? So it's not very high on if the Falklands get taken, it's not, on the face of it, it's not that existential. So as a result, the government was okay, we don't necessarily need to have that many people defending this, right? So when the islands end up getting invaded, this ended up actually being a massive humiliation for Britain, because while in practice it's only a few islands, in principle it's the invasion of British sovereign territory by another country, right? Especially by a military dictatorship, right? So you can't really just let this thing slide. And so as a result, Margaret Thatcher sent a task force down to the Falklands to go and fight them, right? And over the 10-week conflict, remember it's a conflict, not a war, over the course of 10 weeks, they managed to get down to the islands, and obviously it was very difficult for them to retake the islands. They had to land there, but while they were landing, the Falklands are within a range of the Argentinian Air Force from the mainland, so they're able to fly their jets over and attack the ships and attack the men who are there and stuff. So it was very, very contentious and stuff. There was many points at which it looked like it wouldn't actually be successful. In particular, when they sunk two of the ships that were there, the Sheffield, and can't remember what the other one was, but I'll have it on screen now. And then also as well, as we kind of made the point as well, the rest of the world, took the Argentinian side, right? So that it's alleged, we don't fully know the ins and outs of it yet, but it's alleged that even the Soviet Union, had a part to play in this, they helped the Argentinians out, and the sinking of those two ships it's not fully confirmed, but the Soviets may have played some sort of like a part in that, right? So the whole rest of the world was against us, and even like American stuff, they wanted to be on the good side of like Latin American countries, especially during like the Cold War and the fight against communism. So they was like, we can't come out too strongly against this, right? And also something to note as well is that NATO, Article 5 of NATO, I think I've got the right one, it says that an attack on one is an attack on all. So you'd expect, the whole of like NATO to actually come to Britain's defence, but they didn't. And neither did like the Commonwealth. New Zealand helped us out a bit apparently, but other than that, no one actually came to help. So it was all on Britain. The stakes were very high, and if we had failed, then it would have been on us, right? So, with regard to this conflict, basically the what if is what would have happened if the task force had ended up being sunk, right? And what I'm going to use as the pivot for this what if is the most controversial point of this whole war.